More importantly, the lead actor, Chukwuma Kaduna Nzeogu, certainly did not see himself as pursuing any Igbo agenda. He was one of the Igbos who had been born and raised in the north. In Kaduna, his best friend was Olusegun Obasanjo, a Yoruba man. His politics was pan-Africanist in the mold of Azikiwe. When asked about whether the coup was driven by a tribal agenda, his response was categorical. He said, in the north, no. In the south, yes. We were 5 in number. And initially, we knew quite clearly what we wanted to do. We had a short list of people who were either undesirable for the future progress of the country, or who by their positions at the time had to be sacrificed for peace and stability. Tribal considerations were completely out of our minds at this stage. But we had a setback in the execution. Both of us in the north did our best, but the other 3 who were stationed in the south failed because of incompetence and misguided considerations in the 11th hour. The most senior among them was in charge of a whole brigade and had all the excuse and opportunity in the world to mobilize his troops anywhere, anyhow, and anytime. He did it badly. In Lagos, even allowing for 1 or 2 genuine mistakes, the job was badly done. The Midwest was ever a big problem. But in the East, our major target, nothing practically was done. He and the others let us down. Ademoyega is equally emphatic in dismissing the suggestion that the coup was driven by an ethnic agenda. Ademoyega wrote, contrary to the load of wicked propaganda that had since been heaped on us, there was no decision at our meeting to single out any particular ethnic group for elimination or destruction. Our intentions were honorable, our views were national, and our goals were idealistic. We intended that the coup should be national in execution so that it would receive nationwide acclamation. What seems clear is that a coup of the kind that Flight Lieutenant Rawlins was to later carry out in Ghana, a non-partisan and across-the-board elimination of those who had been identified as the enemies of a united Nigeria, is what the lead coup plotters had planned, as well as ending the bloodshed in the western region that the Balewa government was neglecting. A key objective had been to reorient the army. In the words of Ademoyega, listen, if the army was made to see itself as part of the people, to embrace the same ideology as the people under a revolutionary and not a political party system, and if the army was turned into a productive arm of government, then it would neither have been used as an instrument to sponsor political riots, as was the case in the days that Lieutenant Colonel Azan U. Kassina governed northern Nigeria, nor could it have been used as an instrument of pogrom, as it was used in the days that Gowon took over the reins of power in the Federation. It would also not have been used as an instrument of arson, looting, and brigandage, as it was used during the Civil War. The economic order was to have been changed so that Nigerians could produce most of the things that they needed for the betterment of their lives. There was to have been a program of mass education, and the system of traditional rulers had been marked for abolition, according to Ademoyega. Ademoyega wrote, a post of Obas, Obis, Emirs, and Amayanabos constituted the greatest anachronisms in the Nigerian society of 1965. These natural rulers were useful instruments of corruption and compromise, first under the British and later under the Nigerian politicians. Of what use to the society were those glorified idols that had eyes but would not see, and had ears but would not hear, but merely served as conduits to pass a bribe to the people in order to miscarry social justice? Many of them were diabolical, and their continued existence is inimical to social takeoff and progress. Wow. In the area of foreign policy, the plan was for Nigeria to live up to its independence by putting an end to our total dependence on NATO weaponry. That the plans were never carried through was because the coup was hijacked by the conservative forces within the army, without the people actually realizing what had happened. Hardly could the people tell much difference between the Unze-Ogun group of revolutionaries and the Ironsi group of reactionaries. More so because Ironsi did not publicize this difference and deliberately refused to tell the world that Unze-Ogun and his group had been clamped in jail. People thought Unze-Ogun's coup succeeded and they installed Agunye Ironsi. That is why the propaganda of claiming the first January 15 coup of 1966, the reason why the propaganda of calling it Igbo coup was because those who planned the coup, announced the coup, Unze-Ogun and others, they were clamped in jail, while Ironsi was riding on their victory, making the people believe that, yes, the military are taking over, and Ironsi is now in charge until the later dates. So let's continue. The coup was only given an Igbo coloration as an excuse to deal with the Igbo challenge to northern rule. Far from being driven by ethnicity, the most remarkable feature of the January coup, is that a significant number of the principal actors in the coup were the first graduates to enter the Nigerian army. I will take is that going to be my second tea break? So the second tea break for me, and maybe a tea break for you too. So let's thank you so much, by the way, for listening in. Interesting, isn't it? Very, very interesting. History is great. And for us not being prisoners of history is greater. When you know better, you have to do better, my dear. You see all this tribalism, ethnicism, religious fanaticism, all of these are politically sponsored and ingrained into our system for one reason and reason only. When we remain that way, this contraption will remain a hellhole for all of us. But when you know better, you are expected to do better, my dear. You are expected to do better. My TikTok broadcast seems to have stopped, so I'm going to put that back on while I'm doing my tea break. Give me a sec. Right. So thank you so much, everyone who is still here with us. And you have to do better than the Better Edu. Here you get. Better Edu is a thief, a career thief, a career criminal in the midst of the people you can call the locusts, the leeches that feed off, the people. Always remember that. When you know better, you do better. Not like better edu, but better than better edu. Right. Let us continue. By January 1966, the Nigerian Army had 7 graduates with combatant commissions. They had Lieutenant Colonel Emeka Ojukwu and Victor Banjo, and majors like Olufemi Olutoye, Major Adewale Ademoyega, Major Emmanuel Ifeajuna, Major Emmanuel Udeaja, and Major Oluwole Rotimi. All 7 were Southerners, and either Igbo, Ojukwu, Ifeajuna, Udeaja, or Yoruba, Banjo, Olutoye, Ademoyega, and Rotimi. 3 or 4 of these graduates were involved conceptually or physically in Nigeria's first military coup. Banjo and Ifeajuna were students together at the University of Ibadan. Banjo and Udeaja had degrees in mechanical engineering from the Royal Military College of Science, Shrivenham, UK. Ojukwu had a degree in history from Lincoln College, Oxford University. The combined intellectual capacity of the principal military actors in the military in January 1966 coup and the Biafra sequel is certainly interesting. In this, they were a completely different class from their army colleagues who went on to rule Nigeria. Emmanuel Ifeajuna had literally lived to fame by winning a gold medal in the high jump at the British Empire and Commonwealth Games in 1954. He had followed this achievement with a science degree at the University of Ibadan before joining the army in 1960. Adewale Ademoyega, the Yoruba man in the coup plot, received a degree in history from the University of London before joining the army in 1962. Odumegu Ojukwu was arguably the most educated soldier of them all, having attended CMS Grammar School, King's College, Lagos, Epsom College, and obtained a master's degree in history from Oxford University. That these graduate soldiers all ended up on the Biafran side of the divide at the start of the conflict, and all, with the exception of Ojukwu and Ademoyega, were killed in one way or another by the end of the war, suggests that the long-standing war against educated natives were being played out within the Nigerian army. What is clear is that the lead actors in the January 1966 coup were radicals and intellectuals rather than Igbo tribalists. It was the educated natives whose presence in the army had been of such concern to the British, who were rising against the gangsterism and disorder, corruption, and despotism of the new order that the colonial office manipulations had brought about. Among the senior officers arrested, officers with degrees and officers who had spent at least 2 years in England at Sandhurst were prominent. Of the 14 captains and officers of higher rank, 8 had been to Sandhurst, although there were only 6 graduates in the army who held combatant commissions. 3 of these were accused of taking part in the plots: Lieutenant Colonel Banjo, Major Ifeanyi and Major Ademoyega. The impression that it was an Igbo coup for the Igbos to grab power from the north came from events and circumstances beyond the control of the coup plotters. First was the fact that most of the leading minds of the coup were from the rank of majors in the Nigerian army. And due to the recruitment policies that were in place while the army was under British control, most soldiers of that rank were Igbos. The Nigerianization program unwittingly stratified the army on ethnic lines. By the mid-1960s, the army's most senior officers were career soldiers who had originally enlisted as NCO, non-commissioned officers. That's what NCOs means, okay? And then risen through the rank, most of these were Yoruba, Samuel Ademulegun, Babafemi Ogundipe, Ralph Shodeinde, Robert Adebayo rather. Immediately behind them in seniority were the first Sandus-trained generation of army officers. These men were largely Kanuri Muslims from the north. Zakaria Maima Lari, Umar Lawan, Korv Mohammed. Johnson Aguiyi Rossi was the only member of the army's top stratum that was not Yoruba or Kanuri. The lieutenant colonels were ethnically diverse. Example, Ejo, Ojukwu, Kurubo. But many of the majors were Sandus-trained Igbos. And most junior officers like lieutenants and non-commissioned officers were northerners who had been encouraged to join the army's infantry by an army recruitment campaign by northern politicians. This meant that when the senior strata of the army officer hierarchy ended their careers, their successors commanders would inevitably emerge from the middle grade officers' ranks dominated by Igbos. These Igbos would be directly commanding mostly northern subordinates. The psychology of this relationship was later to prove fatal. Thus far from the army being the tribalized institution in the country, it was itself ethnically stratified. Thus, so at the coup, being an Igbo plot driven by tribal sentiments, it is odd that all the lead Igbo actors were young Igbos who had spent all or most of their lives living in the north, who were more comfortable speaking Hausa than Igbo, and whose connection with the Igbo heartland was tenuous to the point that they barely could find the way to their family compounds in the east unassisted. Again, it would seem that the Igbos were doing their utmost to headline their tribal agenda. Thus, although the Council of Ministers meeting of 16th January 1966, which handed over power to the army, included members from other ethnic groups, it was an Igbo man, Dr. Nwafo Orizu, the Senate President, who made the public announcement that a fellow Igbo, Aguiyi Rossi, was taking over. The picture of a brazen Igbo takeover was then completed when the new Igbo leader appointed his fellow Igbo, Francis Nwokedi, to recommend the dismantling of the federal arrangements that had been the North insurance against the threats of Southern domination. Are you following? Of course you are. The narrative that the coup was an Igbo attack on Northerners is further undermined by the fact that not only did Aguiyi-Ironsi leave his personal security in the hands of the northern soldiers, his administration gave preferential treatment to northern politicians. Whilst the administration had no qualm over arresting and detaining members of other political parties, it left NPC politicians untouched, even though, as the party in power, it was the excesses of this party of the North that had precipitated the coup, the Niger Delta Republic. The special relationship that existed between the Fulani North and the Jaws of the Niger Delta requires explanation. The patchwork of ethnicities within each of the major regions meant that each had fault lines that would force eruption on any increase, real or perceived, in the power of the dominant ethnic group. In the eastern region, the Jaw people of the Niger Delta were to the dominant Igbos, as the TV ethnic group were to the dominant Hausa Fulani in the northern region. Just as the action group had been hard at work cutting the Tifis to the NPC, so the Tifis, so the NPC had been cultivating a relationship with the Jaws. It was the Jaws who first reacted to the January coup that produced the new Igbo leadership, when on 23rd February 1966, little more than a month after the coup, Major Isaac Adaka Boro declared the independence of his Ijaw people from Nigeria and the creation of the Niger Delta Republic. The Ijaw revolt lasted just 12 days before it was crushed by Nigerian forces, making it the 12-day revolution. For the insurrection, Isaac Boro received a long jail sentence. But in May 1967, in the run-up to the outbreak of the Biafran War, he was granted an amnesty by the federal government. It should come as no surprise that after his amnesty, he joined the federal side against Biafra. With all the propaganda value that brought to the federal cause, he was then killed, though in mysterious circumstances, on 16th May 1968, before the war's end. In the use of force to crush the Ijaw secession, the Igbo-led federal government had set a precedent for the federal reactions to the Igbo people's own secession attempts when it came. In the meantime, they had created a vengeful neighbor at their rear within the geographical space that they would soon call the Republic of Biafra. The 29th July 1966 counter coup. For one, into whose lap power had so suddenly dropped and who had no track record in political science, it is curious that Aguiyi-Ironsi seemingly had a clear view about the constitutional order that Nigeria needed. Within days, he was declaring that all Nigerians want an end to regionalism. And in February, he had set up his one-man commission of inquiry to report on the means by which a united Nigeria could be delivered. On 24th May 1966, Aguiyi-Ironsi proclaimed a new decree, number 34, by which he abolished the regions and declared Nigeria ceases to be what has been described as a federation. It now becomes simply the Republic of Nigeria. This was a strange move in the climate of the times. The North opposition to a unitary Nigeria was common knowledge. they had threatened to pull out of the Federation altogether in the wake of the constitutional crisis following the Action Group's 1953 independence motion, and had only been persuaded to remain in the Union by the British assurances that the federation with the South would be a loose one. Beyond the curiosity surrounding his name, Ironsi was no stranger to the colonial offices, having been aide-de-camp to Governor Macpherson. Added to this was the presence of his British predecessor as head of the Nigerian Army, Major General Welby Everard. On a return visit to Nigeria when the coup happened, and then there is the coincidence of the January 1966 coup, with a spate of coups occurring around this time in various African states that had recently attained independence from European powers. Gabon in February 1964, Algeria in June 1965, Congo, Leopoldville, November 1965, Central African Republic, January 1965, and Ghana, February 1966. Writing around the time of the July 1966 counter coup in the New Left Review, one Roger Murray made the following observation. During the past 3 years, actions initiated or prosecuted by the military has determined the overthrow of no less than 11 African head of states, and has seriously endangered 4 further regimes. 8 of the successor regimes are headed by military men. Over the last 6 months, coups have proceeded at a feverish rhythm. In the aftermath of the January 1966 coup in Nigeria and the unification decree, it was said of the Ironsi administration that, as far as can be discerned, they aimed to restore the political institutions of the old colonial era, recreating a new guise, the hierarchy of governor, residents and district officers, united in a single public service and advised by subservient natural rulers. This was a sudden and fundamental shift of political discretion. 8, it was a direct assault on everything that the North, under Ahmadu Bello's leadership, had been holding out for. Bello's mother, followed by the removal of the buffers against Southern domination that he had erected, especially the regional civil service, was bound to produce a violent reaction. Major General Philip Effiong, the second in command to the Biafran leader, General Ojukwu, is blunt in his assessment of the events leading up to the counter coup. So, General Philip Effiong wrote or observed, there was good reason to believe that there was a British-backed plan for a northern reprisal action. The Ahmadu Bello University had, for instance, become a center for counter-insurgency planning under the instigation of a former British officer who had once served in the Nigerian Army. The reaction came on the 29th May 1966, just 5 days after the promulgation of the decree, with the first round of a series of murderous programs against Igbos in the north. Then came the counter coup on 29th July 1966, led by Lieutenant Colonel Muritala Muhammad, beginning with a wholesale slaughter of Igbo officers within the barracks, starting in Abeokuta and repeated across various barracks in Lagos, Kaduna, and Kano. Care was taken to ensure that weapons were issued to northerners only. This elimination of Igbo officers was a first step in a war to come. After dawn on 29th July, The massacre of officers and men of Eastern origin took place all over Nigeria with a speed, precision, and uniformity of pattern that took away any subsequent excuse or spontaneity. Ironsi had spent just 194 days in office before he was murdered in this counter coup. By the end of his short tenure, Nigeria had been returned to something very close to the colonial model, a unitary government with a unified public service, free of political parties and elections. The next most senior military figure after Ironsi was Brigadier Ogun, a Yoruba. But this was about power, not seniority. Northern officers having made it clear that they would, with Maimalari, Thor, Lagema, and Palm all dead, Yakubu Gowon was now the most senior surviving Northern officer in the Nigerian army. As a Christian from the Middle Belt, his appointment had the attraction of playing down the Muslim-Christian divide whilst restoring power to the North. Like Ironsi, who he was succeeding, he too was close to the British administration, having served as a chief administrative officer, adjutant general under Welby Everard until the Britain completed his tour of duty in January 1965. In the aftermath of the counter coup, Nigeria was back to a unitary government under Northern control.